Okay, everyone, shall we start? Thank you very much for coming, everyone, and welcome to the Sir Charles Wilson Building. My name is Michael Given. I'm the Head of Archaeology here at the University of Glasgow, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's second lecture in the Dalrymple lecture series. Before that, just a very little bit of housekeeping. We are not expecting a fire alarm, when do we ever? But if there does happen to be one, please leave by the exits on each side here. There's one at the back, and proceed out of the building. And the other thing is, as you can see down here, the lecture is being filmed. However, the questions and answers at the end will not be filmed, so you needn't worry about speaking up. Now, yesterday, Professor Lucas set the archaeological clock ticking, and he talked about absolute chronologies and relative chronologies, and what they do and how they work, and warned us to be careful about our chronometric hygiene. And then he had this wonderful sort of tour de force, what I might call a brief history of the singularization of time, talking both about extending it through the AD system, both back and forwards, but also scaling it. So you've got millennia up here, and down here you've got a 9,000 millionth of a second. Gavin did it more exactly than that, but it was something in that order. So that's this whole story of the singularization of time. But as I expect you noticed, there's one thing that we didn't learn, which is how things change, because as time goes on, well, things change. Now, how does that work? How do we deal with change in the archaeological record and in archaeological analysis? Well, I'm sure that you have been lying awake worrying about that all night. So I'm happy to say, ladies and gentlemen, that you are in the right place at the right time to have all of those questions resolved. And so please, could you welcome Professor Lucas to give the second lecture in the Dalrymple Lectures this year on changing times. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Wow, I'm a bit worried now. I'm not sure I'm really going to resolve any questions about change, but I'm going to talk about change, as Michael said. And I'm going to certainly deconstruct the concept and try and make us think a little bit harder about what it's involved when we talk about change in archaeology particularly. Now, yesterday I devoted a lot of my attention, as Michael said, to absolute chronology, by which I kind of mostly meant a dating system expressed in relation to the solar year. And I described how it should be seen as socially, historically constructed, but also stressed this really important quality, which Michael mentioned, this singularization of time. That there's just a notion of one time in which all events unfold, and it's this kind of metrological character of time, this ability to measure events, is infinitely scalable, again, as Michael pointed out, as up and down or sideways, to accommodate all these different tempos and different processes, both of the natural world and the social world. So from millennia down to nanoseconds, all have been coordinated into this singular temporality regulated by the International Organization for Standardization. Yes, there's an office for time as well, and a document known as the ISO 8601, which basically stipulates all the ways in which time is coordinated and controlled and managed by this, ultimately by the cesium atom. Now, of course, these are an abstraction, a reduction, and even if they serve a very useful function, but this singularized conception of time that this system engenders is still very much a social construct. We made it. A lot of work goes into maintaining it, and we shouldn't forget that. Tonight, though, I really want to switch my focus to this other type of chronological system used in archaeology. For those who were here last night, I talked about this basic distinction between absolute and relative chronology. Absolute chronology meaning dates, whereas relative chronology is all about sequence, and we think about things like stratigraphy and so on, or typologies in terms of relative chronologies. Now, one of the most important things about distinguishing a relative from an absolute chronology is that, as I mentioned last night, relative chronologies lack duration. They only really define sequence. They tell us what came earlier, what came later, what came before, what came after. What they don't tell us is how long something lasts. They can't tell you how much years a certain deposit or accumulation of sedimentation represents. They don't tell you how long the Bronze Age lasts, or so on. Now, phrasing it like this seems to kind of throw up an inadequacy of relative chronologies. They're not quite as good as absolute ones. They tell us sequence, but they don't tell us how long, whereas absolute chronologies do both. They tell us what came first, but they also tell us how long it was before X followed Y. That makes absolute chronologies sound much better. However, we can think about this in another way. We can think about relative chronologies as telling us something about change. Indeed, that is precisely their strength. They may lack the metrological precision of absolute dates, but what they lack in precision, they make up for in what you might call relevance, social or historical relevance. A date, after all, is just a date. It doesn't really tell you anything unless you can put events to it and start to tie those events together and use those dates to tell you something more interesting. A relative chronology is structured on a sequence of events and has this comparison built into it, if you like. What, of course, that means and whether it means anything significant is another issue altogether. Now, in many ways, and I touched on this at the end of my talk last night, the impact of these new Bayesian methods, Bayesian modeling methods applied to C14, which try and reduce this temporal resolution that C14 gives us. But it isn't just about increasing the resolution of our dating. What these Bayesian methods do, in a sense, is also combine and bring together absolute and relative chronologies in a much more systematic way. In a sense, Bayesian modeling starts to erase the very boundaries between absolute and relative chronologies because they exploit the qualities inherent in relative chronology to help refine and give us those more precise dates that we're looking for. None of this, of course, dissolves or gets rid of the individual methods and techniques used in seriation, stratigraphy, and typology, or the particular processes used to generate a radiocarbon date. But what it does suggest is that the chronological frameworks which we build have to be constructed through this very tight combination of both relative and absolute, that it starts to make less and less sense to talk about two different dating systems. We have a whole set of different methods which we bring together to produce one chronology. But even if we argue this, there's still a difference between a chronology as a means to measure time and the temporal quality of the events themselves. And this is really what I want to start to focus on now, tonight, and in tomorrow's lecture, this temporal quality of events rather than time as something which is just a measure. Both absolute and relative chronologies are dependent on events, of course. C14 is dependent on the event of radioactive decay, the death of an organism, and a host of other properties and processes. But the event dependence of relative chronologies is quite different. What's really unique about, or specific about relative chronologies is that these events are much more place-specific. Another way of saying this is that in relative chronology, time is much more closely bound to space than it is with absolute chronology. That's why it's also very hard to generate a singular or a universal relative chronology. It's very easy with absolute chronology. We have this universal singular system of dates in which everything can be fitted in from the Big Bang right through to the time that we had breakfast this morning. But with a relative chronology, it's very hard to achieve that kind of universality. Relative chronologies are very much tied to the specific times and places. And although archaeologists have often tried to expand this, there are limits to how far you can do it. Each excavation uncovers its own unique, specific stratigraphic sequence and stratigraphic profile. Each region, its own specific sequence of material culture. And although relative chronologies can expand outward to cover larger areas, generally, the larger the area they go, the more risky these chronologies become. And they have to almost become more abstract and more reductive to be successful. Now, periodizations, things like the Stone, Bronze, and Iron Age, for example, are classic exemplars of this more kind of general relative chronologies, ones which are, of course, familiar to historians, archaeologists, paleontologists, geologists, and so on. And in terms of human history, the only truly singularized relative chronologies that we've really come up with are these various social evolutionary schemes that have been proposed. Going back to the 18th century, these Enlightenment conjectural histories, or the 20th century neo-evolutionism, and so on. And these were common to a lot of social sciences, including archaeology. Of course, they're no longer in favor today. But these are very abstract systems which define a historical sequence on very general concepts of cultural development or social complexity. We're a long, long way from stratigraphy here, but essentially it's the same process going on. Then the three-age system, of course, which is one of the first and prime models or theories used in archaeology, was the first archaeological relative chronology to strive for some kind of, I wouldn't call it universality, but at least generality. And of course, it was based on technological innovations and cutting implements. Unlike the evolutionary schemes that I've mentioned just now, it does retain a link to stratigraphy. Of course, it was developed by the Danish antiquarian Christian Thomsen in the early 19th century and became a standard framework for ordering prehistory throughout Europe by the end of the century. But the trouble is, the further away you got from northwest Europe, where the system was developed, the less it seemed to work. Africa always seemed to lack a Bronze Age. China dropped the Iron Age as prehistory had already given way into history, while in the Americas, the system didn't seem to have any real purchase at all. So even as a generalizing system, the three-age system has its limits to how far you can transport it and move it around the globe. It starts to break down. In a sense, the only real global success the system had was when Gordon Childe, in the early part of the 20th century, interpreted these technological stages of stone, bronze, and iron into economic stages using a Marxist interpretation of prehistory and kind of merging these social evolutionary narratives with the three-age system. And of course, what we've got now is these Childe's pivotal markers. It's like the transition from hunting and gathering to farming and the emergence of state-level societies, which Childe defined in terms of the agricultural and urban revolutions, respectively. As befitted a kind of Marxist perspective on prehistory, these are kind of major historical events preceding the third great revolution, the industrial one, that was at the center, of course, of Marx's work. Today, although both universal periodizations based on Thomson's three-age system and the socio-economic transitions based on Childe's revolutions still structure archaeological research to some extent, they've lost a lot of their force as chronological systems. Relative chronologies still play a vital role in archaeology, arguably a central role. We can't get by without stratigraphy, for example. But the aspiration for a singular or universal periodization is not a common objective anymore. Yet there still exists this tension within archaeology between an inbuilt tendency for relative chronologies to be multiple and this aspiration for singularity inflected through absolute chronology. And this, again, comes into why I spent a lot of time talking about absolute chronology last night and singularization, how it seems to infect sounds like the wrong word, but it kind of colors the way we want to interpret the past, even through relative chronologies. Of course, most of us would like to anchor our relative systems and our relative chronologies onto an absolute one, to put dates onto these phases and periods which we use. But the tension is also manifest in more contemporary aspirations, for example. I'm thinking here of the work of the historian Daniel Lord Smale and his call for a deep history, which seeks to erase the boundaries between prehistory and history. Or the work of someone like David Christian in his vision of big history, whose goal is even more singularizing, to link human history with cosmological history. So Christian has this notion of a single history, starting with the Big Bang and ending with the Anthropocene, or whatever you want to say. So such calls for a deep history and a big history share in many ways with these 19th century evolutionary accounts this same drive towards singularization, even if they lack a sense of a universal periodization. However, such criticism should not blind us to some of the positive messages of these ideas. For example, the divide between prehistory and history is really deeply disturbing and troubling and really is in need of dismantling, as is the divide, for example, between human and non-human histories. These things are becoming much more salient in archaeological discourse today. But my chief concern really is that we need to keep this vision of a singular history tempered with an equal concern for multiplicity. It's exploring tensions between multiplicity and singularity in chronologies that I really want to start with tonight. And to help with that, I want to begin with a story about a research project I'm working on at the moment. Now, I'm in the middle of preparing a monograph. I have been for quite a long time now. It's long overdue, but on large-scale excavations I conducted in Iceland in the early part of the 2000s. The excavations focused on a core of a bishop's manor and school. The settlement is called Skálholt, and it's in the south of Iceland. It was established sometime in the 10th, 11th century. But our excavations largely focused on the upper levels of this settlement the last 300 years, 17th and 18th century, right up to the mid-20th century. So altogether, we looked at about 300 years of continuous activity and occupation. Now, in the process of writing the narrative of this site and its site chronology, I faced a troubling dilemma from the start. Now, one of the things that I've constantly been trained to do as an archaeologist from my first days in undergraduate and in my experience in contract and commercial archaeology is that what you do with these site narratives is that you break the chronology down into a series of discrete phases or periods. This is just standard practice. You have your matrix, you have your stratigraphic sections, but you try and phase your site. And this is something I'd done routinely on numbers of other sites before this. Now, sometimes these phases or periods even have subphases. Major periods and phases, of course, are meant to mark major changes and transitions, with the smaller ones being less significant. This is relative chronology at its most basic, turning a site stratigraphy into a series of site-specific periods and phases. And then ultimately, ideally, we can link calendrical dates to these phases and periods. And this is something that's pretty standard. Now, this kind of phasing, which we could think of as just periodization writ small, is of course never arbitrary, not in the sense of being random. It always aspires to follow change. But when people or scholars talk about the arbitrariness of periodization, what they usually mean is that it's something imposed by the scholar on the past or on the course of history, rather than something inherent in history itself. The problem and potential arbitrariness lies really in choosing where to make the cuts. Changes are all around us all the time, but as scholars studying the past, we usually have to elevate and focus on some changes as being more relevant and more significant than others. And this brings me back to the problem I have with this site. When I look at my site, even the 3 centuries that we excavated, it's hard to see any real way in which I can cut this site up and create site-wide periods. The stratigraphy and the building history of the site really is much more organic. Each building underwent its own rhythm of change following repairs and alterations. So what you can see here at the bottom, these are just all the individual structures. We had about 30 structures, and these are the kind of longevity of each structure, when it started and when it went out of use. And within these structures, I could have also divided this up into different phases of each structure to show the different rhythms and so on. So in short, the stratigraphic sequence of the site reflected exactly the kind of transformation you actually experience walking around any town or city today. Piecemeal change, something happening here, a building being raised here, repaired here, one being knocked down there. You don't have any large-scale coordination or synchronized transformation. The bulldozers don't come in and level the whole area and we start up from scratch. Of course, it happens sometimes, but this is not how change normally happens in urban contexts or in built environments. But that's what phasing makes us do, in a sense. Phasing forces us to think about the site in these really arbitrary divisions. So how do I do that? How do I get around this problem? However I cut the cake, something's going to get mangled in the process if I try and do what I've been trained to do. So here I went against my training. I resisted this urge to phase the site altogether. After all, what was this urge except the very drive towards singularization that is inherent in absolute chronologies? What we're trying to do is phase the site, is crunch all these different temporales together and make them march in step and produce a single time. That's exactly the problem I was talking about last night. I didn't need to do this, in a sense. I had this already. I had my dates on this site. Why try and fit the multiple chronologies of my buildings into the same mold as an absolute chronology? It simply wasn't necessary. It's not only hard to do, it simply doesn't capture the complexity and manner of change which all our hard work, careful strategic excavation had revealed. This isn't to suggest that I've thrown any sense of phasing or periodization out altogether. We still have it within the structures. These structures still, I've broken them down into individual structural phases in the buildings, but we have no site-wide universal phasing for the site itself. Now, as I said, this went against all my training. But it seemed like a good thing to do. I thought it was really good. Here I was bucking the trend of singularization and sticking with the multiplicity and messiness of my site. Good, but it had horrible consequences. In making a decision to dispense with a site-wide periodization, I found I'd only traded one problem for another. One of the reasons why we use these site-wide phasing is because our fine specialist comes along and says, well, I want to put all my animal bones and I want to look at some temporal pattern. Can you give me your site phasing? Tell me what's phase 1, 2, phase 3, phase 4, so I can look at changes in the faunal assemblage. The same with the pottery specialist and so on. I didn't have that information to give them anymore. I didn't have this site-wide phasing. How do I get around that problem? That's really tricky. So how do I deal with the problem of tracking change in my artifactual or faunal assemblages once I get rid of that? Initially, I was really stumped and struggled with a solution. I thought of really complicated ways of getting around that, but they were not satisfactory. However, in the end, I realized that I didn't really need to do that. I was lucky with this site. It's a historic period. It's quite recent. So in that sense, my chronology and my dating resolution was quite good. I had absolute dates tied to my building phases. I didn't need to fall back on a site-wide phase, and I could just basically construct analytical units, building phases for my specialists, and tell them these units date to within, say, 1660 to 1690. That's your thing. And then you deal with it, and you construct the phasing you want with your material based on that. I had a very good set of independent dates from clay pipes, coins, pottery, glassware, and other items, as well as, of course, documentary sources about the site. All of this allowed me to date my phases, building phases, to a quite high level of resolution, the decadal. Obviously, it varied a lot between buildings. Sometimes it was a lot worse, sometimes it was a lot better. But on average, my average temporal unit on my site was about 3 decades or 30 years. So my method involved, in a sense, creating an absolute chronology based on the resolution afforded by the site itself. In this case, units of 30 years, or a tricennium. That's not a word you hear much, but since our decimal system prefers us to think in terms of tens, decades, or centuries, and so on. But again, I wanted to remain faithful to the resolution of my site, not some arbitrary convention. So armed with a tricennial chronology, if you like, I can now bypass the need for a singular site-wide periodization, and once again focus on the specific rhythms and temporalities of change exhibited in the material culture at a tricennial scale of resolution. Now, this got round my impetus, the need to singularize my various relative chronologies through a site-wide phasing, but it did present another problem. It's not just that the different structures on my site were changing at different rates and at different tempos, but the material culture sequences also had their own internal clocks, which, like buildings, sometimes synchronized and sometimes did not. There's just a selection of 2 of them, and then even again, you can cut these in different ways to produce different rhythms and different chronologies. So looking at the chronology of ceramics, for example, you get a major transition in ceramics in the beginning of the 19th century with the emergence of industrial factory-produced ceramics coming in. So if you look at pottery, this is where your big periodization falls in the early 19th century. But if you take another category of material culture like window glass, the major change there is happening in the end of the 17th century, which is changing in window technology. And again, I could have focused on different aspects of these changes in these different objects, or I could bring in other objects, and it would start to multiply. So in other words, the more materials I start to track, the more new temporal boundaries will emerge. So in resisting singularization and embracing the multiplicity of relative chronologies, I actually got far more than I bargained for. So beware of what you wish for. I got multiplicity by the bucket load. Every item of material culture could potentially carry its own periodization. But I think that's a rather good thing. This is good. Yes and no. In the sense, I was being more faithful to the different objects and their temporalities than a site-wide phasing would, which seems to mangle everything into a single uniform sequence. We always try and compress things together and make them fall in line and step, rather than embracing the fact that each has their own different rhythms and different tempos. But the problem is, of course, once you have all these multiple different temporalities going on with these different objects and different aspects and components of the site, how do you bring them all together? So the real problem is really dealing with multiplicity. If you accept that, how do you deal with it? And particularly, how do you start to generate a coherent story and a coherent narrative when all your things are going off at different rates and different rhythms? And should I give some more significance than others? Should I give the fact of pottery changing in the early 19th century more importance than that fact of window glass, for example? So these problems highlight, I think, 2 issues around multiplicity and archaeological studies of change. And these issues have received a lot of attention in our discipline in the last, 20, 30 years. One concerns the politics and the kind of historical narratives we want to write. Almost any periodization we adopt will cut across multiple contexts and objects, and will end up giving some attributes more salience, more importance than others. The American historian Jennifer Morgan's critique of the periodization in US history is a good example, because in a sense what it does is if you try and study slavery in US history, it really doesn't conform with the blocks and periods that are adopted in conventional US periodization. And to give a more archaeological example, another question of bias, I'm thinking of the Spanish archaeologist González Marcin's work on the Bronze Age of Iberia, where she's kind of shown how the Iberian Bronze Age periodization is also inflected by a very androcentric bias based on the selection of objects used to create the relative chronology. It's very, very biased towards male objects, and if you focused on female objects or association, or considered the gendered associations of objects in your periodization, it would show how these things are inflected. And these issues have been taken up more recently by people like Maynes and Wattner, and their general criticism of prehistoric periodizations in general, as structured on androcentric concerns, such as the very focus on technology, which is implicit in the three-age system, at least as it originally devised, or of course, the Eurocentrism of many of our narratives. Now, these are really important issues that show how something that seems basic, like periodization and phasing, still has political implications, which we can't ignore. But they also speak more to questions of epistemic pluralism than time per se. So I'm not really going to dwell much further on that, even though it's a really interesting aspect of periodization. I really want to focus on the other issue, which is that of scale, because this has received a lot of attention, and it's also a word that's used a lot when it comes to time. The concept of scale and time scale is bandied around a lot. And it's often done, I think, in a very unreflective way. So I want to spend a lot of my time tonight deconstructing this notion of scale in relation to time. Now, these temporal rhythms that I've been talking about from my site in Iceland, the different tempos of material culture and buildings and so on, we can identify them and break them down, and we can recognize that some of them have quite different temporalities and different speeds. So, for example, if I take one building, this is a kitchen in the settlement I looked at. I did a study of breaking down the temporality of this structure using a theory from an architectural historian, and thinking about how buildings are constructed of multiple layers. So you've got things like he divides them up into these categories of stuff, space, plan, services, and skin. So the site, for example, refers to the location, the plot on which the building is constructed. And these tend to be quite long-lasting. And then you've got the structural elements of the building, what hold the building up. You've got the skin, the cladding, the walls, and the outer surfaces. Things like services, which, of course, in contemporary architecture, we think about heating and water running. But in my 18th century buildings, I'm talking about drainage systems and ovens and so on. So you can think about these different components, architectural components of a building. And what I did was study how each of them got replaced on different tempos and scales, which is kind of what this map shows, this graph up here. So different aspects of the building got replaced and repaired at different rates than others. And again, this is something we're all familiar with. You know, our own houses, some things need repairing and fixing much more regularly than others. Now, so this notion of scale was automatically somehow linked to this notion of tempo and the speed in which things change in some sense. But when we think about how timescales are discussed in archaeology, or even in history for that matter, it's very difficult to talk about scale without mentioning the name of that, of course, famous French historian Ferdinand Braudel, and his name's going to come up a lot in my talk tonight. Braudel's famous distinctions of historical time into three scales or tempos, the event, the conjuncture, and the longue durée, are very well known. I'm not going to elaborate on them much here, but I will come back to them later in my talk. They're adopted and used by a lot of archaeologists in the 1990s, and they still remain quite powerful concepts for some people to deal with the complexity of the archaeological record, because they enable us to traverse these different timescales and think about things happening on both the scale of moments to millennia. But there's also a really big set of problems entrained by using them that I think archaeologists perhaps are not quite fully engaged with. I think it's interesting to contrast three different approaches that have emerged in archaeology in the last decade, all of which use the concept of scale and to mediate between archaeology and history. I talked about this, breaking down this divide or this barrier, for example, between prehistory and history. Let me just briefly enumerate these. The first is Clive Gamble, of course, the Paleolithic archaeologist, and his endorsement of deep history. Now, deep history is, again, something I mentioned in connection to the historian Daniel Smale and his concept of neurohistory. And Clive Gamble has, of course, been a big proponent of this in archaeology. The aim here, of course, is to pull down this divide between prehistory and history by affirming a long-term perspective and also reviving a vision of a united social science. It's long-term. This notion of deep history is what can bring all these disciplines back together again: anthropology, archaeology, history, and so on. This, of course, also draws on the classic strength of archaeology, its access to the long term. This is one of the things that archaeologists constantly say that we're really good at. We have access to long-term timescales, which no other discipline does. You know, history stops when written records basically go back as far back as that. Archaeology has this long-term perspective. A somewhat different approach is taken by Alistair Whittle, whose work I mentioned last night in the context of this Bayesian modeling. He's been a key figure in promoting these new techniques to obtain tighter chronological resolution. But for Whittle, the prehistory-history divide is breached not through so much a long-term perspective, but through access to the short-term, through the fact that we can make archaeology more like history, that we can talk about events and change in archaeology at the same scale in which historians can, or at least as close as possible as historians can. We're talking decades again. The third and final approach is one, and I guess maybe this is the golden mean, the one that tries to argue for a multiscalar approach, one where archaeology needs to grapple with the way different processes and practices play out at different scales. This is the basis of John Robb and Tim Poikat's goal of bringing together big histories and human lives. It's also evident in Chris Gosden and Lambos Moloforos' call for process archaeology, that paper they wrote a few years ago, where they're trying to, again, encourage us to be attentive to the multiple different timescales. Now, of course, putting it like this is a little bit unfair. I'm sure both Gamble and Whittle would endorse a multiscalar archaeology as well. In fact, probably most archaeologists would if you pressed them. Although we recognize the advantages of archaeology of dealing with the long term, we also perhaps appreciate that a multiscalar approach is what we need. So this is a little bit of a forced opposition. Nonetheless, I think the emphasis that has been put on these different aspects is interesting. But my point here really is not so much to emphasize these different approaches, but really, I guess, to underline what they all have in common. And that is that they're invoking this concept of scale as somehow the solution to the problem. Whereas I see the problem lying in the concept of scale itself. And this is really where I want to start to deconstruct this notion of scale in relation to time. A good place to start is actually an example that Chris Gosden used in an earlier paper with Karola Kusanov, exploring the concept of time in archaeology. And they drew on the example of Boxgrove. Some of you will know about this Paleolithic site in the south of England, in Sussex. It dates to about 500,000 years ago. What makes Boxgrove interesting is that excavation of the site uncovered residues of activities that maybe represented only about 15 minutes of action. They're seeing the debris of single episodes of napping flints. It was as if these early hominids had just left the site a few hours before the archaeologists arrived. Now, of course, this image seriously misrepresents the hours and weeks spent by archaeologists carefully uncovering these traces. But the key point here is that these residues clearly speak to a moment in the past at a very human scale of experience. Archaeologists have a name for these situations, or sometimes we refer to them as kind of Pompeii sites or Pompeii moments after the Roman town buried under volcanic ash. We also know they're extremely rare. Well, perhaps not extremely rare, that's a bit of an overstatement, but they're perhaps not the norm either, which led to the coining of this phrase, the Pompeii Premise, which is something that archaeologists, that we use to refer to when archaeologists interpret their site as if it was like Pompeii, reading the residues and traces as if they were direct traces of past events, as if they'd not undergone all kinds of transformations since the original activities which led to their deposition. We can call it a kind of archaeological source criticism. Ironically, though, of course, it's even been suggested that Pompeii itself was no Pompeii in this sense, insofar as people did not just up and run, leaving the pot still boiling on the hearth, or stay frozen to the spot, waiting to be encased in ash. It took time for the site to be covered, and in that time, all kinds of things happened, which will have disrupted normal routines. So Pompeii was no Pompeii. I'll be talking a bit more about this Pompeii premise as well tomorrow night. But even though there was no volcanic eruption covering Boxgrove, there was an equally sudden burial of the old land surface upon which the residues of these activities took place, which is why Boxgrove has the feel of a Pompeii. The site lay at a foot of a chalk cliff which collapsed and buried the site in a sudden landslide. So what makes the example of Boxgrove interesting for a discussion of timescale is really about how this very high resolution record of events is situated within an absolute chronology. Dating the site of Boxgrove is not easy, in fact generated its own set of controversies. C14, which I talked a lot about last night, doesn't apply here because we're talking about a time long preceding the 50,000-year cutoff that C14 usually works on. Different set of dating techniques we use, and I'm not going to go into them here. But even if we accept this date of 500,000 years BP for the site of Boxgrove, more precisely, the resolution of this dating leaves a lot to be desired. We're talking about some time between 478,000 and 524,000 BP. It's a 46,000-year window within which these 15-minute episodes took place. We don't know when in this window they took place. It's kind of very frustrating. So we're not talking about days or years or decades or even centuries, but sometime within this very vast time scale. It's like the proverbial needle in a haystack. How do we bridge such vastly different time scales? In a sense, archaeologists face this problem all the time. The Boxgrove example is really a good example because it presents an extreme case and sharpens our perception of the problem. But almost any site will actually throw up these similar sets of issues. The site I was talking about earlier in Iceland, even though I was working within 30-year time units or tricennia, and it was no Pompeii, there were still features that you know represented much shorter time scales. There was a construction of a fireplace that you know must have only taken them maybe a day to build. Found a coin that was deliberately placed under a foundation, which you know only took a matter of seconds. So we have these Pompeii moments, and most sites will have these Pompeii moments, even if our dating resolution won't quite be able to coordinate and calibrate them in the same way we want to. So even if I could have these moments on my site, tying them down, and my 30-year window is still much better than the 46,000 years they had to deal with Boxgrove, a lot can happen in 30 years. A whole human life can come and go. A short one, of course. How does one relate one act to another in this 30-year period? Really, the problem is still quite troubling. Now, part of the answer of this, or part of the attempt to answer this, deals with this concept and issues of contemporaneity, which I'm going to talk a lot more about tomorrow. But another part of it deals with how we address the concept of scale. One of the things that Gosden and Kirsanov stress in their paper on scale in archaeology and time is that scale is relational. The scale you adopt is dependent on your point of reference. Is it the human lifespan? And if so, what span do you choose? Since it's so variable, human lives can vary a lot in how long they live. Some of us live for a very long time. Some of us, and certainly in the past, live for much shorter periods. Similarly with objects or material culture, some objects can last centuries, a long, long time. Some get used and discarded and broken and dissipate in hours. They argue that because of this variability, this very variability in the material world, we need to embrace a multiscalar approach to the time, but one which, in a sense, doesn't try and reduce time or understand time on analogy with space. Now, space is an interesting thing here because scale is a very spatial concept, and this is where the waters start to become very muddy here. It's very common to make criticism to make that we spatialize time. One of the problems with absolute chronologies and abstract notions of time is that they're spatialized versions of time. We're thinking about time in terms of space. And these critiques go right back to early 20th century philosophers like Bergson and Heidegger, if not earlier. But I think it's a lot more accurate to argue that if time seems spatial, it's really because both space and time underwent a similar and joint process of abstraction and singularization over the 17th and 18th centuries, which is something that I discussed last night. The concept of scale, to my mind, is really bound up with this same process of singularization. The very scalability of time is connected to the drive towards singularization. And it's this connection that also lies behind the Boxgrove paradox. Because in our systems of time reckoning today, we've created a universal timescale that links nanoseconds to millennia on this pyramid of scale time, which I showed earlier. We kind of feel inherently the need to make the same connection here at our site of Boxgrove. We feel inherently dissatisfied that we've got episodes that we can recognize in the archaeological record that took 15 minutes, but we cannot somehow tie those 15 minutes down anywhere within this 46,000 years. It goes against all what we've tried to achieve with this notion of a singular time. So in a sense, the very dissatisfaction is driven by this same creation of time that we've made ourselves. But there's also another and perhaps more pertinent issue that lies behind the Boxgrove paradox, and that's the conflation of time as a unit of measure and time as that which is measured. Again, this legacy is part of the same singularization of time. But the concept of scale is bound up in this conflation in other ways. So sometimes when archaeologists talk about timescales, they're talking about the scale of resolution or unit of measure. Might be talking about decades, about centuries, about millennia. Although sometimes when they talk about timescale, they're referring to the duration of an object or process. So in this example here, we can talk about the scale of this event of flint knapping, but we can also talk about the scale of years of our chronological resolution. And we're using the word scale to refer to two very, very different aspects of time and temporality. One is about our measuring systems, and one is about the events themselves that we're trying to measure. It's this conflation that explains why the Boxgrove example also seems problematic. In the case of the 15-minute flint knapping activities, this is really about the duration of the event, while in the case of the 46,000 years, we're talking about the unit of measure. Now here I want to draw on a really useful analogy that's been put forward by the anthropologist Chris Simonetti, as expressed another way of expressing this problem and this distinction in relation to time spectivism. And that's the difference between optical and digital resolution. Now, optical resolution, as you can see, so optical resolution is at the bottom. It's basically, it's like the reading chart you see when you go and see the eye doctor. Whereas digital resolution is about pixelation. There's no change in scale. Scale has nothing to do with digital resolution, whereas scale is all about optical resolution. And again, it's this confusion that's really interesting here. So optical resolution is about scale and the ability of a device to differentiate between 2 points. Digital resolution is about the clarity of an image based on the density of its pixels. So what we could say is Boxgrove offers us a very high digital resolution of the site, but a really lousy optical resolution. Now, personally, I would really rather we restricted the term scale solely to refer to the unit of measure, to the questions of optical resolution. And if we do that in some ways, then the question of scale is only really relevant to our dating methods and has nothing to do with the duration of events, the things that we encounter on sites. This is, of course, not to say that we can't do things to improve these dating methods, to increase our optical resolution, like Bayesian modeling and so on, but that has nothing to do with the ability of the resolution of the record itself. The temporal structure of the archaeological record varies, and it varies a lot, and has nothing to do with our ability to increase our chronological dating methods. The two are completely different things. Now, there's one more third and final problem that still remains to be solved, and in many ways, this is also the most important. If the concept of scale as a measure has been conflated with the concept of scale as duration, then this conflation is also carried out over into our understanding of change. And this is really where my discussion of scale morphs over into the topic of my talk tonight, change. I'm finally getting there. Nowhere are all these issues of conflation more apparent when we think about scale in relation to Braudel and his vision of history and his three scales of time, which I'm going to return to now. So let me kind of revisit Braudel's 3 scales of history: the event, conjuncture, and longue durée. Now, frequently we refer to these, of course, using the French terms, or we refer to them as I just talked about them, but also we use the word short, medium, and long term, and we often use these interchangeably. But even though we use the term scale to refer to these 3 temporalities, what we mean is not really scale as a unit of measure, but scale as duration. Of course, there's some alignment between the two. For example, we use smaller scales of time, days or years, for smaller scale events, durations like the events and so on. Now, this conflation is easy to do in history because you don't have that same problem in history with chronological resolution, at least not in most cases, as we do in archaeology. But I think it's because there is this problem in archaeology that this conflation is missed. So herein lies the first problem with Braudel scheme. First of all, why are there just these three scales? Is it really the case that one can group historical processes broadly into three sets based on their duration or tempo? Well, of course not. And if we think so, maybe the fault really is us trying to stick to Braudel's system religiously rather than with Braudel himself. Now, in many ways, this is a minor issue. And apart from some die-hard Braudelians who would want to stick to three tiers, most archaeologists who endorse a multiscalar view of time don't stick to these three at all. They're more happy to have multiple scales, any number of them. More worrying, really, than these particular three types is that these scales are often read as durations, as tempos or rhythms. Thus, the short term deals with fast-moving events, momentary flashes, the medium term with slower-paced repetitive events, like economic cycles and so on, and the longer term is the slowest of all, barely changing, such as the natural topography and the geography. And this, of course, is all in Braudel's own historical work. These things come out. Even this characterization is a little bit misleading. Certainly there is a sense in Braudel's own work that speed or slowness, that is tempo, defines the three temporalities, like the second, minute, and hour hands on a clock. But I think this really misrepresents the ontological differences between these three concepts of event, conjuncture, and structure, which is why it's very dangerous to substitute short, medium, and long term for them. One of the most common criticisms of Braudel's schemes is that it becomes very hard to interrelate these three scales or these three concepts. That analysis of events and conjuncture and structure all seem to take place independently. And in the end, it's often the longue durée that trumps all the others. Now, this is perhaps true, but maybe it's not so much a failure as something that's inbuilt into the model itself. And it's something that will become clearer when I try and unpick these concepts and reinterpret them in a slightly different way. Because I want to suggest that these different temporalities aren't just different durations or tempos, but actually involve very different concepts of change. What we need to do is think about what we mean by change. Describing change purely in terms of rhythm, fast, slower, and very slow, just really doesn't cut it. Of course, that is one way to talk about change, but it's certainly not the only way. And when we talk about scales of time and scales of change, we end up always talking back in these same terms. It kind of locks us into the same way of thinking. Of course, there's an enormous diversity to different rhythms and different tempos. But this distinction that Braudel brought out between event, conjuncture, and longue durée, or structure, certainly relates to something more, I think, or I'd like to think so. Let me take the difference in the first two, for example, between event and conjuncture. Events are typically short-lived, but more significantly, they tend to be unique. Singular occurrences like a political uprising, a volcanic eruption, and so on. Conjunctures, on the other hand, at least as Braudel usually defined them, are iterative events, repetitive occurrences that occur over years or decades or even longer. Economic cycles are classic instances here. Now, of course, rebellions and volcanic eruptions can recur all the time, but the difference between their occurrence and repetition is vital here. Repetition implies some kind of cyclical nature. And again, I was very critical of the notion of cyclicity last night. It was really in opposition to linearity. I've got no problem with cycles per se. It's really with conjuncture that we can embrace or can feel this notion of rhythm or tempo, and this is really where speed does have some purchase, certainly, but less so with events and structures. Structures, of course, in Braudel's scheme typically refer to the geographical conditions, but also, particularly when archaeologists have adopted them, enduring mentalities, ideological structures. Now, it seems to me, although we can describe structures as very slowly changing, Braudel, more often than not, describes them as unchanging, the stable, enduring backbone of history. This, of course, doesn't necessarily have to be read in absolute terms, but it is relative to conjunctures and events. So what we have are, in a sense, three different temporalities, each with three different conceptions of change. Events as singular occurrences, conjunctures as repetitive cycles, and structures as enduring forms. Penelope Caulfield, another scholar who's written a lot about time, and particularly in time in relation to history, has suggested something similar in her book, Time and the Shape of History, where she invokes a three-dimensional model of time made up of deep continuity or persistence, evolutionary micro-change, and radical discontinuity or macro-change. Her concepts don't quite line up with my characterization of Braudèl's terms, but there's certainly a common recognition here that an ontological dimension to change and time is needed, and is more than is simply implied by this question of scale or tempo. Now, perhaps I'm just stating the obvious here, but it does seem to me that archaeologists, at least, if not many others, have not really fully taken on board the ontological implications of these three Braudelian terms, especially in relation to change. Braudel himself actually often gives very ambivalent renderings of these three concepts, sometimes implying they represent three different kinds of change, sometimes just implying they represent different tempos or scales of change. So what I want to do really to kind of end up my talk is try and provide a reinterpretation of Braudèl's three concepts rather than say this is what Braudel meant to say. This is really my attempt to reinterpret Braudèl's concepts. The first thing I want to do is really suggest that we can uncouple any association with these three terms and the idea of scale, of short, medium, and long term. Events, conjunctures, and structures can all be seen as short, medium, or long term. And once we've done this uncoupling has been achieved, the second thing is to then rethink what these terms and concepts might mean, what kind of change they might evoke, rather than simply think about them in terms of the speed or scale over which they operate. So I'm going to start with the first one, this decoupling of the concepts to their kind of scale of view. Now, discussing events in terms of multiple scales might seem tricky, but I think it really doesn't take a lot of hard work, a lot of work to really think these through. Of course, there are all kinds of examples in the archaeological record that I've already alluded to tonight, such as the Boxgrove flint mapping example, which have lasted very short periods. And of course, there are other more protracted events like building houses and so on, which may have taken days or weeks. But the question is, how short does an event have to be classed as an event? I guess part of this is a prejudice about what we think of as events as. But if you think about things like battles and wars and the kind of material culture associated with these are quite protracted, long, drawn-out structures, archaeological structures that we see in the archaeological record that certainly surpass this kind of momentary flashes that Braudel seems to imply. One, of course, can question whether it's appropriate to call a whole war an event, but again, I think this is about a prejudice about our way of thinking about events as being short duration, or rather mixing up the notion of event as something which is short versus another concept of the event, which is more, I guess, about radical change. And this is where, I guess, in archaeology, some of the most biggest events that we can think of, like the Neolithic Revolution. Yeah, is it an event? I don't know. But in a sense, using the word revolution conjures up something of this notion of radical change, which an event is supposed to do. But the Neolithic Revolution was certainly no momentary flash in the pan. People are now talking about the slow Neolithic and the slow revolution. And we're talking about something which obviously took thousands of years. This is an event which unfolds over the longue durée. It's an event. And I think one could argue that. It just depends, again, on how one's defining these concepts. If we move down to deal with conjunctures, it's a little bit easier now to deal with the multiple scales of time here with conjuncture. It's not difficult to find examples of scales that stretch from the very fast to the very slow, right down to kind of daily routines, annual festivities and festivals and so on. Even things like parliamentary elections, economic cycles going up the scale, and then long-term economic cycles and settlement patterns kind of being up at the high end here. So in many ways, the existence of cycles in human society is actually easier to sell for the short term rather than the long term. But often these things are also a case where we can start to explore the intersection of natural and social events and how the kind of two, or the division between the two, isn't so clear-cut. Here is also where we can start to draw on some classic examples of Braudel as they've been used in archaeology. And I'm thinking of here particularly of the work of people like John Bintliffe in Greece, who argues for these 400 to 500 year agricultural cycles of boom and bust in his landscape survey, or the work, more recent work in resilience theory, and particularly in the southwest of the United States, that's looked at the way natural cycles of environmental change, such as intermittent dry periods and so on, have an effect on social structures such as settlement abandonment. So here, these different rhythms of climate changes coupled with events in settlement abandonment and establishment. And of course, it's done in a way to explore issues of adaptability and so on. But these scales, again, are traversing quite different durations. Now, both of these examples look at medium to long-term primarily in relation to cycles or rhythms evident in settlement patterns or growth. And a very similar focus is also given by Alistair Whittle in his work on the Neolithic and the use of Bayesian methods again. But what Whittle kind of, again, emphasizes that these rhythms and tempos don't have to be seen as regular. They're not kind of clockwork. They're not following a regular rhythm, that tempos can go fast and start to slow down. And that with the use of kind of more refined chronologies, we can start to track down the actual variation in these tempos. And again, I think this is a really important development. And finally, just quickly to move on to structures, again, we can think of them as lasting long or short. And of course, the typical view of structures is that they inhabit the longue durée, the scale of the longue durée. And there's lots of good examples here in archaeology, like Hodder's work on the domestication of Europe and so on, which I don't really want to go into any detail here. But also other uses of the longue durée in notions of deep history and so on. But structural change is not just confined to the long term. Structural change, in a sense, it depends how we define structural change. And if we define it as the kind of beginning or the emergence or the death or cessation of some structure, basically its birth or its death, then this too happens at all scales. If human biology can work on a very long-term structure, then the individual human body itself is also a relatively short-term structure, formed in the womb and dissipated in the grave. Anything can be seen as an enduring structure if its identity is seen as persisting between a beginning and an end, between 2 points in time. And here I think it's useful to just quickly make a quick philosophical aside to Aristotle and his conception of change and his distinction between substantial and accidental change. His notion of substantial change is really an idea of something which has a continuous identity. So, for example, an individual like myself or like you, we have this continuous identity, and it starts when we were born and it finishes when we die, if we think about it at least biologically. But over that continuity, there's all series of accidental changes. We grow old, some of us lose our hair, and these kind of accidental changes don't really change who we are. We have this kind of persistent notion of an enduring identity underneath it. Now, Aristotle isn't the last word on this. Of course, a lot of philosophers have come up after him and suggested other ways to explain this. And I don't want to get into philosophical issues of identity and change here and how the different notions play out here. I really want to focus on this idea of linking this notion of change in terms of something beginning and something ending, that something is finite, has a finite temporal duration. And that's really the important point I want to stress here. Structures have a beginning and have an end. And whereas conjunctions or cycles and events don't quite have this same feature, cycles are iterative, they repeat. Of course, they kind of begin and start, but it's the same beginning and the same ending repeating themselves over and over, whereas structures start and stop and just once. Events also, yes, you could say they have a beginning and an end, they have a duration. But again, if we're focusing on events in terms of how they understand and relate to change, they're much more kind of point-like. They're both beginnings and ends simultaneously. They're the end of one thing and the beginning of another. They're kind of a discontinuity, a break. So I want to end quickly by trying to summarize what I said here about my revisiting the Braudel, because I realize I'm in danger of going over the time quite horribly. And just think about this. Events are, in a sense, viewed as singular occurrences, being unique. They seem almost inexplicable, but we can describe them. We can talk about antecedent events which led up to them and so on. But for Braudel, for example, events were often considered unimportant, what he called the froth of history. But I suggest really we need to think about events in a more positive way in terms of what kind of historic significance events have. Things like tipping points and turning points, bifurcations and convergences, historical fractures and discontinuities. These are all, in a sense, event-like changes, but they have very different qualities. I want to give some very quick examples. One is, I guess, a very common narrative in archaeology, this kind of Marxist structuralist influenced account, which involves what one might call a dialectical inversion, where you have one kind of massive change that takes place by inverting a set of terms. And again, Hodder's work on the domestication of Europe is a good example. He talks about this shift from the domos to the agrios, this kind of inversion. But this domos-agrios opposition was kind of present all the time, but it's all about this switching of emphasis. The same kind of dialectical inversion has been invoked in other cases, like, again, of Jim Dietz's work on the transition from the medieval to the modern mindset and how you get this inversion from communal to individualizing practices and so on. So this kind of notion of the event is this kind of hinge point, this kind of switching over. Another example comes by scholars who have used this notion of path dependence, and particularly the idea, for example, of how early decisions have a constraining effect on later choices or options. And again, the classic example here is the QWERTY keyboard layout, which was developed as a system of letters on the keyboard, QWERT on the top left-hand corner. And how this was developed in the context of mechanical typewriters, because it was found that the layout of these letters was the most efficient for not getting the mechanical arms of old-fashioned typewriters all jumbled up. But of course, once you develop electronic typewriters and computer keyboards, you no longer have this mechanical problem. So there's no need to have this same system of layout. But you look at your keyboard today, it still has the QWERTY system. So even though it actually makes it harder to type in terms of the letters that we use, it's kind of got locked in and become the most standard way to lay out the keyboard, simply because this is what we got used to. So this notion of path dependence and getting locked in, of course, has become very popular in recent archaeological theory, particularly, again, I'm thinking of Hodder's work on entanglement theories, where people get locked in terms of their relationships to objects and animals and things. And this is a lot how he describes the domestication process, for example. Thinking about conjunctures as rhythmic change, again, we come back to this notion of biological and social cycles. And again, I just want to quickly illustrate this through some of the examples of how they get used in archaeological writing. And the most simple way in which these get expressed is through this typical periodic way in which we write about periods and change through this tripartite structure, early, middle, and late, or what get expressed in terms of what we might call these bell curves and well curves. So you talk about accounts of history going with the rise and the flourish of a period and then its steady decline, or the opposite, these well curves. We have a golden age into a dark age and then rising up again into a modern age. These are very typical kind of tropes in the way we structure our narratives. And sometimes we're conscious of them, sometimes we're not, but they still very much inform what we do. Just to give a very quick example, Icelandic historiography falls within this classic trope of the right-hand side, the kind of well curve. The golden age is the age of the sagas and the first settlers, and then it all descends into darkness once it becomes part of the Norwegian-Danish kingdom. And we have a long dark age in Iceland, which only dissipates when Iceland gains independence again in the late 19th century and 20th century. And these kind of classic ways of writing history inform a lot of what we do. But they don't have to be thought about just in these terms. We can try and break out of these kind of molds and think about rhythms in much more creative ways, thinking particularly about different tempos and the way different rhythms intersect and interact. And I think a really useful concept here is this notion of polyphony, which was used by anthropologist Anna Singh in her work on capitalism and supply chains. Some of you may be familiar with her work there. But I think this idea of how different rhythms and tempos of practices can interlock and work together to create what she calls polyphonic assemblages. Of course, sometimes they don't create harmony at all. They start to gel, and then you've got cacophony, not polyphony. But I'll just give a really simple example again. The use of wood for keeping a fire burning Now here, this kind of simple act of using fuel on the fire, it's a repetitive act you do every day. You put fire to keep the hearth burning on the fuel. But that's linked to the cycles of coppicing and woodland management. It's also linked to things like the climate. When you've got a really bad winter, you might use more wood, more fuel, and that impacts that. It also related to the cycle of woodland regeneration and things. So you've got multiple different processes and cycles all interlocked here. And we think about how all these practices interlink. And this, I think this is perhaps an issue that came up in Michael's comment last night when he was talking about ecological cycles and so on. And then moving on to the last thing, structures. I talked about structures as being something which have a beginning and endings. And again, archaeological narratives are very much driven by a lot of the tropes here. We see the very term archaeology, arche, derives, of course, from the Greek word for origin or source. And a lot of archaeology could be viewed as a kind of origin narrative, as searching for the origins of things. And it's very easy to trawl up hundreds of books and titles of papers which talk about the origins of this and the origins of that. Origins of agriculture being an obvious classic example. So in a sense, beginnings, the idea of beginnings of things and structuring our historical narratives in terms of beginnings is a very common feature, but not just beginnings, also ends. Sometimes archaeologists address ends, the Maya collapse, the end of the Roman Empire, and so on. But origins seem to be a much more popular topic. So in summary then, I think Broad L's 3 levels of history can really be rethought much more. We need to get away again from this concept of scale and tempo and really think about types of change and what that means. Of course, none of this is to suggest that we're locked into these 3 different types. I'm really just sketching out some ideas here and ways in which we can rethink this. And of course, we can use these different ways together. But I think it's really important to have done this exercise in a little way because it underlines the fact that change isn't just one thing. That when we're dealing with change and multiplicity, it's very important not to just fall back on the language of scales and scalar time, because I think this is to mistake the unit of measure from that which is being measured from the events in the past. If our concern is really to understand the events and processes of history and recognize their multiplicity, then we need to think about what change means and what kinds of temporality are implicated. Sometimes tempo is important, I don't deny that, but it's not the only kind of change we need to address here. And I think really that's what my little experiment has been. I'm certainly not putting this forward as the new typology for change in archaeology. It's really just a thought experiment in this. Sorry, I've really talked for too long, so I should stop and give you a chance for questions, because I'm very happy to answer a few questions. Thank you.